It's been 1 year since the United States Department of Justice investigation into the Cleveland Police Department.
The Cleveland Division of Public Police engages in a pattern and practice of using excessive force.
The final report laying out a pattern of excessive force, inadequate training, ineffective policies, and poor community engagement. And that's where we began. For the past year, our year-long investigation went beyond that DOJ report, revealing the extent of failed patterns and practices.
Candidly, this program was brought to me in 95 and 96 when I was in charge, and I didn't do it.
Why?
Because it was costing overtime.
How police discipline went unchecked for years.
Somebody with alcohol and drug history, that person should not be working as a police officer.
They still are.
And who was responsible for failed training programs?
So who has the responsibility for that?
Well, the chief has responsibility for that.
And you accept that?
It's an investigation that traveled from New York to Detroit,
All I can say is Cleveland, hang in there.
Memphis, Tennessee to Durham, North Carolina.
They made a real big difference because I was struggling.
And before airing, it prompted significant change, including a major overhaul of police training, creation of a Citizens Review Committee, and first ever board to oversee how Cleveland police deal with the mentally ill.
We've changed that philosophy from a warrior community to a guardian community.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Leon Bibb, along with Danita Harris and Chris Flanagan. 1 year ago this week, the U.S. Department of Justice released its report into the Cleveland Police Department.
It found a series of systemic problems that began at the top with the leaders who set policy, then trickled down to the officers on the streets.
But before we move forward, we must take a look back. So how did we get to this point? And why did the Department of Justice begin looking at the police department in the first place? We begin with a night in late November 2012 and a police chase that left 2 unarmed people dead in the Cleveland Police Department on the national stage. 62 police vehicles, 137 shots fired into one car. When the frenzy was over, Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell dead. They were unarmed. 3 years later, 63 officers and 12 supervisors have been disciplined. Just 1 fired. He got his job back. 6 officers were indicted, but only 1 has gone to trial. Michael Brelo was found not guilty of voluntary manslaughter and remains on the force. The 13 officers who shot into that car still awaiting discipline.
This is the United States of America, is it not?
Then there was Tamir Rice. On November 22nd, 2014, just days before the DOJ report was made public, the 12-year-old was shot and killed by Cleveland police.
My son was a baby, you know, innocent, too young to even understand what's going on.
But it was the death of Tanisha Anderson that almost went unnoticed, and her death, more than the others, may serve to underscore the greatest failings at the highest levels of the Cleveland Police Department.
When I lay down at night, that's all I see. That's all I hear.
Suffering from mental illness, Tanisha died in the custody of Cleveland police after her family simply called for help.
We begin our investigation tonight with the mentally ill and how Cleveland police respond to calls for help. Chief Investigator Ron Regan has been digging for answers to those questions for more than a year since Tanisha Anderson, who was bipolar and schizophrenic, died. And Ron uncovered critical failures in one of Cleveland's major training programs.
There's a program here in Cleveland that equips police with crisis intervention skills, but our investigation found it was not being implemented as it should be. And when it fails, it puts both police and the mentally ill at risk.
Help for Tanisha. I just want to get help for my daughter.
Tanisha Anderson's mother remembers the family's call for help.
What type of mental illness does she suffer from?
Bipolar schizophrenia.
Okay, is she taking her medication?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, not working.
Tanisha was not just my daughter, she was my friend. She was my confidant. She was my world. And it changed my world.
Her daughter was bipolar and schizophrenic. Family members described her condition in detail to dispatchers.
She just came home from a mental asylum.
Cleveland police officer Scott Aldridge responded. This certificate shows Aldridge was trained how to successfully avoid violent and potentially deadly confrontations. Instead, police say Anderson began actively resisting and kicking at officers while handcuffed and being placed in the cruiser's back seat. A medical examiner report found she died from sudden death associated with physical restraint.
Do you feel that help was provided in any way?
No. No, it was not provided in any way. She did not get the help she needed.
Tanisha Anderson's death raises serious questions into just how effectively Cleveland's crisis intervention teams function and how it's carried out within the Cleveland Police Department. How was that handled?
Poorly.
Michael Baskin oversees the National Alliance for Mental Illness in Cleveland.
It would seem that if she was expressing symptoms, which I understand she was, I wasn't at the scene so I don't know, then putting her in a hold and putting her on the ground doesn't seem like a fit for someone who may be experiencing a tremendous amount of anxiety. As I understand, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Records show both Aldridge and his partner are facing potential discipline for failing to call for an ambulance in a timely fashion when Anderson was in need of medical assistance.
They're human beings. They're a person, and they should be treated like anyone else. Just because they have a problem or mental illness doesn't make them less of a person.
Tammy Mays.
Nearly 500 Cleveland police officers have completed crisis training since the program began 10 years ago. A program launched by then police chief Michael McGrath. At the same time, the department was facing cutbacks and layoffs. Today, McGrath is Cleveland's public safety director.
When I did become chief of the Division of Police, I revamped the whole training scenario.
But our investigation uncovered key failures in Cleveland's program, including failing to even meet with one of Cleveland's leading advocacy groups for the mentally ill. How many times a year does the Cleveland Police Department meet with your group on a regular basis?
Well, they don't meet with us, NAMI, at all.
How many times would you say you met on a monthly basis with, let's say, Michael Baskin?
Oh, gosh. I couldn't say.
Every month? Every other month?
No, I honestly couldn't say.
This Department of Justice report raises serious questions about how well crisis training has been implemented within the department. Experts we spoke with told us when that fails, it puts both the mentally ill and police at risk. What does this report suggest?
I think it says that there needs to be more interactive with community engagement, and it needs to be real.
Candidly, this program was brought to me in 95 and 96 when I was in charge, and I didn't do it.
Why?
Because it was costing overtime.
He's the former Cleveland police chief and public safety director who should have implemented the changes but didn't.
So what you're doing is incredibly valuable to show a system as it is today, and it's going to be broken in a number of parts, or not even working in some parts.
Later in this investigation, you'll hear why there are failures in this program.
And also why nationally recognized experts question how Cleveland's training has been run.
Does the officers or the rank and file, do they see themselves as being part of that engagement? And that's ownership. That is ownership.
Tonight, we're taking you inside our year-long investigation into the problems and failures at the Cleveland Police Department. Those problems led to a Department of Justice investigation and the subsequent consent decree that lays out the changes the city must make.
We've told you about Tanisha Anderson, a mentally ill woman who died while in police custody 1 year ago. But we've uncovered evidence that the problem extends back years, and it's not only costing lives, but millions in taxpayer dollars. Investigator Sarah Buttison shows us serious flaws in the systems meant to get rid of problem police officers.
If you think getting arrested, getting caught using cocaine, or stealing from your employer will get you fired, you're probably right. But we found that's not what happens if you're a Cleveland police officer and answer to the people who work here.
It was a busy July 4th weekend in 2011 when on-duty Cleveland police officer Matthew Kraska left his assigned patrol area to pick up his friend, off-duty officer Dave Mindek. The pair headed to Parma on a mission to find missing jewelry. They ended up here outside the quaint home on the corner of Wareham Drive that Tiffany Urbach shared with her fiancé Daniel Ficker and their 2 young children.
They should have never been at my house that night.
Earlier that day, Tiffany and Daniel were at a party at Mindek's house. Mindek accused Ficker of stealing necklaces belonging to his wife.
He immediately became irate and yelling.
Tiffany says Kraska grabbed Ficker. They fought. Kraska pulled out his taser. The brutal battle left Ficker with bruises all over his body.
I remember seeing blood.
And then, a gunshot.
I dropped my phone and ran to his side.
Kraska fired a fatal shot into Ficker's chest.
What did you say to him?
That he was going to be all right and that I loved him.
How hard was that?
Hardest thing in my life.
Internal affairs investigators concluded the officers violated numerous police department policies.
They should have been fired immediately.
But they weren't. The city struck a deal with the union to delay discipline until the Ficker family's lawsuit is settled. They never faced discipline.
What effect does that have on the culture?
Well, it has a terrible effect on the culture. Again, it says you can do these things and keep your job.
Sam Walker is a police accountability expert.
I want to focus on the problem of disrespectful and offensive language.
He recently testified before President Obama's task force on 21st century policing and knows Cleveland well. He grew up in Cleveland Heights.
What kind of police department is Cleveland?
Well, it's getting pretty close to the bottom. It's an embarrassment.
Most troubling, the department's inability to deal with officers like Kraska and Mindek.
It means the people in the city of Cleveland are not getting good service.
News Channel 5 investigators conducted an extensive review of CPD's disciplinary decisions during 2014. The 144 officers brought up on internal charges included an officer indicted for stealing from the department, an officer charged with assault after beating a man while off duty, and 3 who pled guilty to drunk driving. We also found 3 more officers were accused of drinking on the job. A 4th tested positive for marijuana and cocaine.
Somebody with alcohol and drug history, that person should not be working as a police officer.
They still are.
Shouldn't be.
Another challenge, when an officer is fired, it doesn't always stick. Between 2010 and 2014, 7 officers filed grievances with an arbitrator after being fired. 6 got their jobs back, including Shani Hanna. She was convicted of assault after she stabbed her boyfriend in the legs and arms during a drunken fight.
It's almost inherent in the arbitration process that the arbitrator wants to split the baby, give each side a little something. If it's a termination, that officer's going to get his or her job back.
There is a need for reform.
Cleveland Mayor Frank Jackson has complained about arbitration, but has defended the department in the wake of a federal investigation that identified several systemic deficiencies, including insufficient accountability.
The mayor has never admitted or said that there's a pattern in practice.
Well, I think the mayor's in denial.
Walker says the solutions are no secret. On the West Coast, the LA Sheriff's Department uses an early intervention system to identify officers with performance problems. And on the East Coast, Washington, D.C. has an agency devoted to examining problems in their police department. But Walker says improvements will only happen if Jackson and Cleveland's leaders commit to change.
It's really a historic moment, and the question is, will Cleveland seize that moment or not?
It's a whole different life that I feel we're living now. Having to explain to, teachers and friends and why isn't, where's their dad, all that. It's torture.
In the meantime, Tiffany avoids reading any news about Cleveland police. She says she doesn't want her children to see how angry it makes her.
What makes you so angry?
just knowing that they're all getting away with all this. Not just Mindak and Kraska, but the other, all the other shootings or beatings, they're all getting away with it.
What about the officers involved in the November 2012 police chase and shooting? 3 years later, we are still waiting to find out if the 13 officers who fired their guns will get into any trouble. We are also still waiting to find out if the 2 officers involved in 12-year-old Tamir Rice's death will be disciplined. It was not the first time Cleveland police have been involved in a confrontation with a child. Kristen Volk, you learned of a victim who is not only a teenager, but one with a disability.
I've been digging into court cases and lawsuits looking for the pattern involving Cleveland officers. And I uncovered the story of a Cleveland teenager with Down syndrome who was chased down by police when they mistook him for a robbery suspect.
911, what is your emergency? I just was robbed.
A call for help sent police on the trail.
He threatened to kill me. I could probably describe him. It was a white male, about 5'8" at the most.
But who did they nab? Meet Juan Ortiz, 16 at the time. He stands 5'2".
I'll keep it.
And he has Down syndrome. Police handcuffed him for robbery.
I had to suffer a lot watching that. Very hard for me watching him, looking at me, trying to say something or trying to say help me, and I couldn't even do nothing.
Juan's dad, Ramon, hopelessly watched his son get arrested by 2 Cleveland cops, Brian Casimir and Dan Crisson. With his disability, Juan had no idea what was going on. It all went down here, outside of this West Side apartment complex where the Ortiz family used to live. August 16th, 2010.
Kept hollering, "You got the wrong one. That's not right. He's not the one." But still happened.
Nina Kennedy, the manager of the complex, witnessed the whole thing.
It scared me so bad.
She says officers Casimir and Crisson pinned Juan to a hot, running car in the heat of the summer for at least a half hour. Then she says the cops yelled at Juan's parents.
"If you can't speak English here, take your ass back to where you come from." That's pretty much what they said. But they also used the F word.
What they did, it was awful.
Juan ended up in the hospital. His injuries, minor, but the emotional trauma, much deeper. The day after, Ramon filed this complaint against the officers here with Cleveland's Civilian Police Review Board. But we found that the system to address citizen complaints like Ramon's lacks transparency and efficiency, and those complaints languish in a maze of bureaucracy and finger-pointing.
Please, if they could discipline these officers and stop them from working in the streets, I will be happy on that part.
Just 2.5 months after the incident, the review board did recommend discipline for officers Casimir and Crisson in this charge letter dated November 9th, 2010. Here, the board called for a simple written reprimand and re-instruction. It stated that the cops handcuffed Juan and yelled to his parents, "You're lucky we didn't shoot him. Shut the F up."
That file came to the chief's office for discipline in July of the following year, 2011.
Mike McGrath was Cleveland's police chief at the time. He says it took 8 months for him to get that letter, prepared by the board's sister agency, the Office of Professional Standards, or OPS.
Why it took that long to come out of the Office of Professional Standards, I don't know.
He wouldn't know. We discovered ourselves that the review board operates under a cloud of ambiguity, and so does OPS, which investigates complaints made against police. Damon Scott leads the agency.
When anyone looks at this looks like you haven't done much of anything. Look at all these, a whole page worth of blank spaces here. No decision.
Well, that is something that my office is addressing.
These documents, which list those complaints and the status of the investigation, show the board has only ruled on 46 of 509 cases in the last 2 years.
Part of the reason that I was hired was to address some of the cases that were not investigated or that were dormant prior to my tenure.
That's what Scott told me a year ago. And 2 months ago, when we tried to ask him about the lack of improvement, he would not sit down with us.
Is there anything you would like me to use in the story or say in the story regarding why there doesn't seem to be any progress made here with complaints and the rulings on complaints.
And as for the review board,
because of the number of cases that the Office of Professional Standards receives each month, we are not able to address each case as it comes in.
Thomas Jones, the board's chairman, first claimed he and his 6 colleagues just can't keep up with the workload, then later backtracked.
So you have all of these cases, most of these cases in here that you have yet to decide on?
I don't know. I have not looked at these cases. Like I said, some of them may have been disposed of at this point, but may not have been posted.
Between the review board, OPS, and Cleveland Police, 5 years later, the Ortizes still wait for closure. And this charge letter still goes unanswered.
They're not doing nothing. They're not really doing nothing.
Ramon tells me the very sight of a police officer still triggers a terrifying flashback in his son.
He goes wild. He goes very wild at nighttime.
Ramon has flashbacks of his own, visions of the moment when he says the officers held his son down.
Even when I was saying to him, he's a Down syndrome, he's a child. He didn't pay attention. He seems to enjoy what he was doing.
At the time, the officers didn't know he had Down syndrome. Afterwards, we found out that he had Down syndrome.
Did this case slip through the cracks?
No, I don't believe so.
On behalf of the officers, the city says it has no comment because the case is ongoing. But for the first time, the Cleveland Police Department apologized to Juan and his family.
It was a mistake by the Division of Police.
Officers Casimir and Kristen are still on the Cleveland police force. The Ortiz family sued them 4 years ago, at the same time that former Chief McGrath tells me he was notified of the review board's decision to discipline the officers. Because the two coincided, any discipline has yet to happen, because when the lawsuit was filed, the city tells me it was their policy to hold off on discipline while all pending civil and criminal matters are settled.
There are programs in place to help train officers in handling the mentally ill.
But experts we talked to call Cleveland's implementation substandard. Still ahead this hour, we take you to Memphis, Tennessee to learn how a city best known for its blues became the nation's leading center for training police on how to interact with the mentally ill.
Plus, what will the changes required to improve our police force cost you? How will it play out on our streets? And when will we see change? Cleveland not the first city to face federal reforms. So coming up, we go to Detroit to learn how that city is changing its force and the cost to taxpayers.
Tonight, we're investigating the pattern of problems plaguing Cleveland police and uncovering the solutions that will bring changes for everyone from the command staff to the police on the streets. And that's where we go next. Cleveland is now the 20th city in the country to have its department come under federal scrutiny. Cities like Seattle, New Orleans, and Los Angeles have all gone through the federal consent decree process. But it's Detroit that most closely parallels what Cleveland is likely to experience over the next 5 years. Investigator Joe Paganakis traveled to the Motor City and heard from the men and women on the streets about what to expect.
Police officers here in Cleveland need to just look across Lake Erie to the city of Detroit for answers as to what it's like to deal with federal oversight of the department. We traveled to Detroit and found out it's not an easy process, one that's filled with hidden costs, mixed results, and could last up to a decade. It's a familiar scene. The streets look almost the same.
How old is she? Is
7.
And if you didn't know,
somebody went out in front of her, so she had to swerve to avoid them.
You might think this is Cleveland. Detroit, Michigan, you might say we're cousins. And this Rust Belt family has been through some tough times. Blight, crime, recession, and now a renaissance. And one thing Cleveland can learn from Detroit?
They grow up being scared of the police.
A city's journey through the winding road of a consent decree.
Yeah, everything's good. Yeah.
We're not so used to seeing you guys like that. It was like,
right?
Scared us.
In Detroit, that road has been going 12 long years. And for Detroit Police Sergeant Al Ruiz, the federal oversight has been a major adjustment from the beginning.
Me and my partner are pulling up right as this consent decree first started, and we see people coming out of this door right here. Right. They had broke in. The place was closed. They had broke in. So we start chasing him. And, you know, I catch the guy, and I remember him trying to punch me, and I'm sitting there defending myself, and I remember thinking, consent decree, and it made me hesitate, and I swore I would never hesitate again, but I remember that. I remember thinking I was going to get in trouble for doing my job.
Sergeant Ruiz is also one of Detroit's community policing officers.
Black male, possibly female, braids to the back, like a blonde puffer coat.
We roll up on 2 Detroit police officers looking for a suspect.
He sweats today, but he's always like kind of creeping, walking back and forth.
The officers don't know they're on camera. Sergeant Ruiz asks them about the consent decree process.
The Department of Justice being here, and
Oh, did it make it better?
did it make the Detroit Police
I
Department
think it
better?
made it better to an extent. You know, I mean, it did. I mean, yeah, certain aspects. Some things got a little too anal, but
Right.
you know, we started to focus on things that weren't the most important, but other
True.
situations, yeah, I think it was.
Yeah. And I don't think we felt like that in 2003 when they first got here, huh?
But, you know, we're old salty dogs.
Right.
We don't like change.
All right, guys.
Well, we do get a new water bowl, then we like it.
Right.
Sergeant Ruiz admits federal oversight has had a big impact on many officers on the force, now required to wear body microphones. Training has doubled.
Having to qualify with our weapon every 6 months, as opposed to before it used to be every year. Having to go to training a lot more often, being trained more on culture awareness, being trained more on how to handcuff somebody, being trained more on how to approach people.
But to fully understand this painful, tedious process, we go back to the beginning, a process that nearly derailed several times.
The blue curtain of secrecy is on its way down.
It started in 2003. 17 Detroit police officers arrested on charges of stealing money, planting evidence, and filing false police reports.
The citizens of Detroit will have a police department that is truly a model for the nation.
The Department of Justice charged Detroit police with excessive use of force and unlawful arrests. Many of the same charges leveled against Cleveland police.
It's my job to keep the city safe. I'll do whatever it takes.
But Detroit's Justice Department process became filled with failures. 3 Detroit police chiefs resign amid scandal in just a few years.
And we will not be shamed.
Then Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, convicted on 24 felony counts of corruption, sentenced to 28 years in jail. Detroit's consent decree shattered even further, though, after it was revealed Kilpatrick was having an affair with the person most responsible for overseeing the entire police improvement process. Justice Department Monitor Cheryl Robinson Wood forced to resign in disgrace.
They killed my niece. The police shot her in her face.
But in 2010, the consent decree process hit rock bottom. 7-year-old Ayanna Jones was shot and killed by an officer during a police raid at the Jones home. Shots fired while police were looking for a suspect. The officer charged with involuntary manslaughter. 2 mistrials. All charges dropped. A city divided. 12 hard years. And after all of that,
there are a lot of problems with the culture of the department.
Ron Scott with the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality. He says the Detroit Police Department has a long way to go, claiming officers continue to use racial slurs, excessive force, and illegal search and seizure. He says young black citizens are still being unfairly criminalized.
We're getting a number of people being stopped in cars for various reasons, and the police are running up to people saying, "Where are the drugs, where are the guns? Are you a gang?"
Residents like Mario Maldonado, who grew up in Detroit's 4th Precinct, say not enough has changed.
I still get paranoid. You know, I don't feel safer. I get more paranoid when I see the police rolling by like, oh, they're just looking to stop me for something.
Meanwhile, Detroit's Police Commission reports there are still 1,300 citizen complaints about Detroit police per year. And while Detroit Police Chief James Craig reports a reduction in police fatal shootings to just 17 in the past 5 years, Chief Craig admits there's always concern about regression.
The cultural magnetic draw that drives a police department back into the way business has always been done.
How do you prevent that?
Well, One, you got to continue to hold people accountable.
Meanwhile, back on the streets of Detroit, I ask the key question. Some community leaders say the culture of the Detroit Police Department has not changed enough. How do you answer to that?
I would invite these community leaders to meet us halfway. We in the Detroit Police Department have made a lot of changes.
And Detroit's consent decree has now been lifted. A one-year transition agreement is now in place. Meanwhile, it's a process that is just getting started here in Cleveland. One of the biggest gaps in training is how officers deal with the mentally ill. And Ron Regan, you uncovered that these deficiencies extend to the highest level of the Cleveland Police Department and even right here to City Hall.
Well, just weeks into our investigation, we spoke with nationally recognized experts on police training based in Memphis, Tennessee, the very same experts Cleveland police are now turning to. It's a city where the blues grew into an icon and a motel balcony that witnessed the assassination of another. But 25 years ago, it also became home to the nation's leading center for police training and the mentally ill. This is Memphis, Tennessee, and what we found here reveals a lot about Cleveland police, excessive force, and an ongoing Department of Justice investigation.
We coined a phrase many years ago, CIT is more than just training.
Major Sam Cochran is a retired Memphis cop. He helped the department launch CIT, Crisis Intervention Teams, the nation's first program teaching cops how to successfully treat the mentally ill instead of arresting them.
We have an individual that has an illness of the brain. I'm afraid some of the attention is get that person off the street and put that person in jail.
I knew I had to keep my hands in front of my body and away from my weapon.
Training videos are used to teach cops how to de-escalate potentially violent scenes.
Why'd you come on down? We're gonna help you out.
Slowing things down, opening up communications is usually at the directions of some level of leadership, and CIT helps to introduce that leadership role.
And it's the identical training program used by Cleveland police for the last 10 years.
Verbal de-escalation will allow the officer to take control with less risk for injury to all parties.
40 hours of classroom training, plus role-playing real-life crises.
We're here to help you, sweetie. We're not here to hurt you. We're just here to find out what's wrong.
I feel stressed.
But police were unable to calm Tanisha Anderson last November. She died in custody while handcuffed and restrained.
If a police department provides that 40-hour training, is that sufficient?
No.
The Department of Justice found serious flaws in how the mentally ill in Cleveland are treated by police.
In this DOJ report, excessive force against persons who are mentally ill or in crisis, including cases where the officers were called exclusively for a welfare check. What red flags does that suggest to you?
As what I just mentioned, probably a level of confidence, lack of confidence.
Cochran believes Cleveland's program fails to involve multiple community agencies.
What are some of those weaknesses that you suspect?
I suspect that CIT may have become more of a training program and not some of the layers that make CIT successful.
Including command-level police officers.
To what extent is that nurturing happening in other areas of the department? Does the frontline supervisors or all levels of supervisors understand the role of CIT?
CIT is more than training. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
What's lacking in the department?
Well, I don't want to say anything's lacking in the department.
Instead, Cleveland's public safety director points to more than 6,000 calls for mental health assistance last year. 2/3 involved potentially violent disturbances or suicide.
And those situations and those letters that we get weekly for officers doing just an outstanding job because they were understanding and caring for that particular family.
But despite more than 6,000 calls involving the mentally ill, the man who now heads up the mental health agency training cops, makes a stunning revelation. In a given year, how many times does the Cleveland Police Department meet with you on a regular basis?
Well,
on a regular basis?
Probably very, very few times.
How many times over that period of time would you say the department or its representative or yourself has met with Bill Denahan's office on a regular basis in sit-downs to discuss the program?
There again, I can't give you a definitive number, but I know it was numerous times that I personally met with Mr. Denahan, Director
Numerous
Denahan,
times.
And representatives from the Division of Police.
So who's to blame for the failures and who's doing it right? I'll take you inside another police department where crisis training is a model program for others.
Tonight, we've pointed out key failures in policy and protocol within the Cleveland Police Department that our year-long investigation has uncovered. And we've shown how they can put the lives of everyone, including police officers on the streets, at risk. But we've also found how it can be done correctly and impact lives in a positive way. To see the successes of the crisis intervention training, Ron Regan traveled south to Durham, North Carolina.
We saw a successful program up close, in stark contrast to what we found here in Cleveland. They're trained, and that's it.
Yeah. Well,
is that right?
I think that's a candid assessment.
William Denahan admits a key police training program has failed to be fully implemented.
It's not only the Cleveland Police Department, it is us and the system that provides the services for behavioral health.
He served as both police chief and public safety director in the 90s. Today, Denahan oversees the mental health agency that trains Cleveland police.
Remain vigilant and use empathy and patience.
How to avoid using excessive force with the mentally ill.
Bring that person's energy down.
Our investigation found it's not what happens here in a 5-day, 40-hour training session, but instead what did not happen. What has gone wrong in the Cleveland Police Department regarding CIT? Why has it not been as effective as it could be?
Well, I think when we designed it, we did not have it designed to that level of importance, as command level height.
It never reached that level.
It never reached that level. And I think that's part of where.
Who's responsible for that?
Well, I think that's the chief is responsible for everything over there.
Oh, I disagree with that.
Do you?
Oh, yes, sir.
Why?
Well, number one is when I did become chief of the Division of Police, I revamped the whole training scenario.
Cleveland Public Safety Director Michael McGrath launched CIT training in 2004 while chief of police and was responsible for its implementation over the next 10 years.
Let me just say this, is that over the years, we've been trying to implement the CIT program to take it to the level where there's other cities. We've been unsuccessful, but it's because you need to get people trained. You need to put these processes in place.
Okay, and so is she having trouble breathing or is she having other issues?
Here in Durham, North Carolina, police are taking crisis intervention training for the mentally ill to a whole new level.
They de-escalated the situation.
Officer William Fleeman was trained in the very same crisis skills as Cleveland cops.
Just built a rapport with him, let him know that I cared.
But our investigation found significant differences. Lieutenant Mark Murray is among those overseeing Durham's program.
Family member asking for assistance for a loved one, someone's acting out. What happens?
Communications will ask certain questions according to their protocols.
Are they CIT trained?
Yes, they are.
That's not true in Cleveland. Our investigation found only 29 of Cleveland's 80 dispatchers are trained.
Why so few dispatchers over 10 years?
The availability of the training.
Here in Durham, it's exactly the opposite.
In that team, we have a number of investigators that are have a mental health person embedded with them. So the whole idea is to deal with the crisis when it occurs, but also try to have that person get resources and assets so they do not go into crisis again.
Felicia Jones is a social worker embedded with police and often on the streets.
Every mental health assistance call that comes through here, after it's responded to by first responders, will be followed through by your team.
Absolutely.
For example, even the homeless are included in Durham's program.
They made a real big difference because I was struggling, didn't hardly know where I was going to eat or sleep, and
you were homeless.
I was homeless. Yeah.
And your two little girls.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, put your hood on.
Kenneth Clate is now employed.
Hey, Daddy. So how you got here?
These my babies. I'm off from work. I got off at 3 o'clock.
How is everything?
Good.
And living in an apartment.
You don't drive away.
No.
And leave them.
No, we don't. The idea is to follow up with them, the next day, later on after they're a little more stable, talk to them, see what they need, see what their needs are, see if we can meet those needs, so the 911 calls stop from that particular person, and they get more productive member of society.
Is that happening right now?
I don't think to the satisfaction of anybody. No, I don't think so.
After I'm assisted, will I be contacted again in any way by a member of the department the next day or the next week, the next month? Followed up with consistently?
Well, see, that's an issue that we are going to implement in 2014.
But it hasn't happened over the last 10 years. Would you agree?
I would agree, yeah. Officers didn't follow up on a particular, they make referrals, but they themselves weren't required to follow up on the call, that particular call they may have responded to.
What you had said was make a referral.
Plus, in Durham, police sit face-to-face every month with roughly 24 community agencies ranging from hospitals to EMS to mental health experts, evaluating how well the program is working. Does anything remotely happen like that here now?
No, not today.
Why?
Well, I don't know the reasons why. What I do know is that we're learning that that is absent.
By comparison, the program in Cleveland simply isn't up to the standard it is in other cities, or what the CIT model calls for. So who has the responsibility for that?
Well, the chief has a responsibility for that.
And you accept that?
Oh, absolutely, I accept that. There's no question about it. And if I could have sent 100 officers to each CIT class, I would have.
And it's the lack of total community involvement that Cleveland now recognizes and is promising to change.
And Cleveland officers who have been trained say they feel the difference. Next, our investigators go out on Cleveland streets with the officers who patrol them and find out how the proper programs are changing lives.
We do what we can, and hopefully the system can help them out the rest of the way.
As we end tonight, it's important to remember the officers who risk their lives every day and deserve the very best training and total community support that should go with it. So Chief Investigator Ron Regan spent time with officers on the streets to see that training firsthand.
For officers who have undergone crisis training, they will tell you how it's helped them make a difference.
We're the first step in the process.
It's late on a November afternoon.
She climbed in her window to get in her car.
Cleveland police officer Dan Day knows that at any moment he could be dispatched to a scene calling for skills he learned in crisis intervention training.
When you're talking to somebody who's hearing voices or having hallucination, they can't comprehend what you're saying. It takes them a while to process what you're telling them to do.
Skills he uses almost every day while patrolling Cleveland streets.
You gotta listen to them, listen to what they're telling you, and ask them how you can help them, and make sure that no one gets hurt in the process.
Day realized quickly the value of crisis training after seeing up close just how many are in crisis.
When I first took it, I was assigned to the downtown car, and we were at the shelters every day. For people not on their meds, needing help, needing taken to the hospital. And I think my partner at the time, I said, we might as well go because we're dealing with them on a daily basis. A lot of people, the medication makes them feel worse, so they won't take it.
From those who need medication to an elderly woman refusing to come out of the house so she could be helped.
And we ended up talking to her for about 45 minutes. Ended up getting a supervisor there, get EMS there, and we were able to take her out and get her to the hospital. And now I do believe she's in an assisted living facility.
But he also knows crisis training on the street is just the beginning.
We do what we can, and hopefully the system can help them out the rest of the way.
And since our investigation first began, Cleveland has now trained 577 officers and 32 dispatchers.
It's our hope that tonight's report will prompt constructive and positive change within the Cleveland Police Department.
And since we first began questioning our city leaders a year ago, changes are already underway.
In May, Cleveland and the Justice Department reached a consent agreement that will oversee changes in the police department.
Our goal is to have real reform that will be sustainable. This agreement is a major step in getting us to that point.
That 105-page document changed the rules for use of force, called for an independent monitor to oversee reforms, created a mental health review board to oversee police interaction with the mentally ill, and instituted a command-level position to oversee crisis intervention training.
We want all our officers to be trained because, again, there are components within crisis intervention training that officers can use in everything.
Specifics of that training were announced in October. They include at least 8 hours of crisis training for every officer to start, 16 training hours for new recruits, and in the end, 40 hours of training for every cop on the force.
And in order to provide the proper service to the people that we serve, we have to be able to provide our officers with the training.
In October, the Justice Department announced a New York-based nonprofit as the independent monitor who will oversee reforms. Vice President Matthew Barge and his team promising to talk to our officers, officials, and neighbors as the group institutes the most far-reaching consent decree he's seen.
The implementation of the consent decree is going to change some ways that things are done at the Cleveland Division of Police. But one thing that will not change in this process is the commitment of all of us involved to ensure that officers are safe and that officers in turn keep Cleveland's communities safe.
This is a story that does not have an ending. It's being written daily as Cleveland's leaders address the needs of our community.
Over the next 5 years, there will be the successes and the failures that come with change.
And our investigators who have spent the last year digging into the problems of the past will be there to play their part in the future, bringing light to the processes and procedures being put in place to keep us safe.